The nebula had walls. I kept recalibrating, running the returns through secondary filters, because what the instruments were painting made no sense. Voron's opacity, listed on survey charts as a diffuse dark matter cloud, 9 light-years across, composition unknown, non-navigable, was showing internal structure. Fixed surfaces, corridors. We were already inside it. "Moren, talk to me." Commander Rex's voice came from the command tier above, clipped and tight with the particular strain of a man managing 6 things at once. "How deep are we?" 14 minutes past the boundary. I pulled the latest sweep and overlaid it on the last 3. The geometry held. Same positions, same proportions, the same impossible architecture. "Commander, I need you to look at this." Behind us, fading into the interference the opacity threw across every long-range sensor we carried, 3 Valdari cruisers were still hunting. 40 minutes ago, they'd had clean firing solutions on the cathedral, a mid-tonnage military transport hauling 60 wounded, and a skeleton combat crew back from a border engagement we'd lost badly. I was the one who'd pointed at the opacity on the charts and told Rex it was our best option. Dense enough to break their targeting, wide enough to lose them. Rex had weighed it against the alternatives, surrender or burn, and approved. Neither of us had been happy about it. But the math was simple. The Valdari wanted us dead or captured, and the nebula was the only door. Now we were through the door, and the room on the other side had architecture. Rex came down from the command tier, bracing against the rail as the cathedral shuddered through some mild gravitational inconsistency. He was older than me by a few years, thick through the shoulders, built like the infantry officer he'd been before transferring to fleet command. He leaned over my console and studied the navigational overlay, the blue wireframe I'd built from the returns, sketching out the space around us. It looked like a cathedral. Massive columnar formations flanked the ship on both sides, rising vertically beyond the range of our sensors. Between them, a vaulted passage wide enough for 3 ships abreast, but bounded, hard edges where gas diffusion should have been. The columns held fixed spatial relationships as we moved, solid, stationary, structures on a scale that made the cathedral a splinter floating down a hallway. "That's not natural." Rex straightened. "No. Gravitational lensing? Some kind of sensor artifact from the dark matter?" "I've run it through 4 filter profiles. The geometry stays consistent. Whatever those columns are, they're real, they're solid, and they're holding position independent of our movement." I highlighted the passage ahead, where the wireframe showed the vaulted space narrowing slightly before branching into 2 smaller corridors. "And they have internal structure, intersections, branches. This is built." Rex stared at the wireframe for a long time. The bridge was quiet. Helm Officer Drigg sat with his hands on the controls, waiting. The 2 sensor operators on the port side had stopped their damage assessment work and were watching us. "Can you navigate it?" That was the question, and it was the right one. Not what is it or who built it. Those could wait. What mattered right now was whether I could thread the cathedral through whatever this was and get us out the other side. "The corridors are wide enough. The geometry reads clean, no rapid changes, no constrictions below our clearance profile." I traced the route I'd already started plotting, a careful line through the wider passage. "This is what I do, Commander. I can work with this." Rex nodded. "Then work with it. Drigg, follow Moran's plots. All ahead, minimum safe." The helm engaged, and the cathedral slid forward into the cathedral. I settled into the task. This was, at its core, exactly what a void navigator does. Read the shape of dangerous space and find the line through it. I'd spent 22 years doing it in rubble fields, radiation belts, contested orbital lanes, gravitational anomalies. The fact that this space was impossible didn't change the mechanics. The returns gave me walls. I plotted clearances. The ship moved through. Simple, professional. The kind of problem that narrows the world to your console and your instruments and the next correction. And for a little while I could pretend that was all this was. But the returns kept giving me more detail as I swept. And the detail went wrong in ways that accumulated. The columns had surface variation, ridges, recesses, protruding shelf-like formations that repeated at regular intervals, like the ribs of a vault. The regularity was architectural, intentional. Someone or something had built these columns the way a mason builds a pillar, with a structural logic I could trace in the geometry without understanding its purpose. And the space between the columns had texture. I don't mean dust or gas. The cathedral's exterior sensors showed density readings in the empty space that varied in a gradient. Thinner near the center of the corridor where we flew, thicker near the column surfaces, as if the darkness itself had viscosity. The viewport feeds confirmed it. The darkness outside wasn't an absence of light. It had depth, layers. It looked less like space and more like deep water viewed from inside, a medium you could reach out and touch. I didn't share that observation. One impossible thing at a time. 12 minutes into the corridor, the drive started misbehaving. Benz, the engineering watch supervisor, flagged it over the internal channel. The cathedral's main drive was losing output, 7% below baseline, with no mechanical cause, no damage, no thermal anomaly, no fuel irregularity. The indicators all read normal. The drive was running perfectly, but the thrust was short, as if something was siphoning the energy between generation and output. I noted it and adjusted my plots for reduced acceleration. Then something on the drive monitor caught me, something Benz hadn't flagged because it wasn't in his standard diagnostic sweep. Every time the drive cycled, a pulse every 4 seconds at our current output, the navigational returns showed a faint secondary signal, a resonance. The structure around us vibrated in response to the drive's energy output. Slight, just enough to register as a shimmer in the wireframe, a brief flexion of the column surfaces that matched the drive's pulse frequency exactly. The cathedral was listening to our engine. I pulled up the waveform and watched it through 3 more cycles. Clean correlation, drive pulse, structural resonance, decay, like a tuning fork answering a struck note. "Commander," I turned from my console. "We have a problem." Rext was at the tactical station reviewing Drigg's helm log. He crossed to me in 4 steps and leaned in. I showed him the waveform, explained it in plain terms. The structure was reacting to our drive output, matching it, answering it. What does that mean? I don't know. But 7% of our drive energy is going somewhere that isn't thrust, and every pulse we emit gets a reply from the walls. I looked at the wireframe. The corridor ahead was branching again. 3 forks this time, each wide enough to fly. If we're feeding this thing energy, we might want to consider reducing output. Minimum power, just enough to maintain steerage. And if we need to run, then we won't have the thrust to do it quickly. Rext weighed it for maybe 5 seconds. "Take it down. Minimum output, maintain steerage. Benz, you copy?" Benz acknowledged. The drive throttled back, and the cathedral slowed to a drift with just enough power to answer the helm. The resonance dampened on my display but didn't disappear. Even at minimum output, the structure still answered. I picked the center fork and plotted us through. The work continued. I mapped as we went, building the wireframe corridor by corridor, and the picture that assembled itself on my screen over the next half hour was vast. The opacity wasn't a nebula with some structure inside it. The structure was the opacity. In every direction my instruments could reach, the returns painted walls, columns, vaulted spaces, branching passages. An architecture so large that our charts had classified it as a cloud because no one had gotten close enough or stayed long enough to resolve the internal detail. And I could not find an edge. Every direction I swept showed more structure, deeper passages, more branches. The geometry densified rather than thinned, corridors narrowing into tighter channels, or opening into vast rotunda-like spaces where the columns were thicker than the carathel was long. I kept looking for a thin section, a gap, a place where the structure gave way to open space and stars. There was nothing, just more cathedral. "How far to the other side?" Rex asked it casually, checking in. The voice of a commander who expects a number. "I can't give you one. The structure extends beyond my sensor range in every direction. I haven't found an exterior boundary." A silence on the bridge that lasted too long. "Keep looking." I kept looking. It was during one of those sweeps, a long-range pulse aimed upward trying to find a ceiling to this place, that the sensor post reported in. The carathel had 8 exterior sensor stations, small booths mounted around the hull perimeter, where a crew member could monitor local conditions through a combination of instruments and direct viewport observation. Most were unmanned during transit. Rex had ordered them crewed when we entered the opacity, wanting eyes on the hull. Station 6, portside aft, was manned by a junior rating named Tob. 23, quiet, competent, the kind of sailor who did his job and stayed out of the way. Tob called the bridge on the internal channel. His voice was steady, the way people sound when they're reporting something they don't understand yet. "Bridge, Station 6. I've got movement outside the viewport." Drigg glanced at me. I pulled Station 6's feed onto my secondary display. The viewport camera showed the same featureless dark we'd been flying through, the nearest column wall sliding past at the edge of frame. "Describe the movement, Station 6. The shadow outside." A pause. "The dark itself, it shifted position, moved toward the hull by roughly 2 meters over about 3 seconds, then stopped." "Wind equivalent? Gravitational eddy?" "Negative. The movement was lateral, toward the ship, and it started before the last helm correction, not after." Another pause, longer. "It moved toward us before we moved toward it." The bridge went very quiet. I checked the helm log. Drigg had executed my latest course correction, a minor adjustment, 2 degrees starboard, at 14:37 and 12 seconds. Tob's report described movement starting at approximately 14:37 and 8 seconds, 4 seconds before the correction. The dark had anticipated us. "Station 6, maintain observation. Report any further movement immediately." "Understood, bridge." I stared at my wireframe and tried to find a rational explanation. Gravitational interaction, tidal flex, some property of dark matter we hadn't catalogued. None of them fit a 4-second anticipatory movement. You don't get precognition from physics. Rex was beside me again, reading over my shoulder. He didn't ask me to explain it. He just stood there processing, and then he walked back to the command tier and began issuing orders to secure the ship. All hatches sealed between sections. Damage control parties stood down to their staging areas. The wounded in the lower hold checked and buttoned up. Military response. A perimeter you can control when the space outside refuses to make sense. 7 minutes later, Station 6 went silent. It happened between one status check and the next. Tob had been reporting in at 2-minute intervals. No further movement observed. Conditions unchanged. Station nominal. His 14:41 report came through normally. At 14:43, the bridge watch called for his check-in and got a low, even tone on the channel. Steady, unbroken, like a test signal running on a frequency just below comfortable hearing. The comms officer worked the channel for a minute, trying different frequencies, checking for equipment malfunction. The tone persisted. It didn't waver. It didn't respond to hails. Rex sent a runner. The runner was a bosun's mate named Terrell, a solid, experienced sailor who'd been through enough emergencies to stay functional. He went aft through the sealed hatches with a sidearm and a handheld comm, and the bridge listened to his progress. Hatch 1, Hatch 2, ladder down to the port side passageway, approach to Station 6. Terrell's voice came back careful and flat. "Commander, Tob is at his station. He's seated, eyes open. He's not responding to voice or physical contact." "Is he breathing?" Yes, respiration looks normal. Pulse is there, but he's... A pause. I could hear Terrell moving, shifting position to get a better look. Commander, his hands are on the console. Flat, palms down. And his fingertips are wrong. Define wrong. The skin, from the first knuckle to the tips on both hands. It's changed color, gone dark, almost black. And the texture, it's not skin anymore. It looks like the same material as what's outside the viewport. That zero light surface, like someone dipped his fingers in it. I was already out of my chair. Rex caught my arm. Moran, I need to see this. He held me for a second, reading my face, then let go. Go, report everything, don't touch him. I went aft. The passageway to Station 6 ran along the portside hull, a narrow corridor with service panels on the inboard side and hull plating on the outboard. The lighting was the same institutional white as the rest of the carathel, but it felt thinner here, somehow less convincing, as if the fixtures were working at capacity and still losing ground against a darkness that pressed in from the other side of the plating. Terrell was standing in the open hatchway of Station 6, half blocking the entrance. He stepped aside when he saw me. Tob sat at his console exactly as Terrell had described. Upright, hands flat on the panel, eyes open and tracking something I could not see, his gaze moving in slow, smooth arcs, left to right and back, following a pattern that had nothing to do with anything visible in the small booth. His fingertips were black. Absolute black. The darkness started at the first knuckle joint and extended to the tips, a total absence of reflection, the same quality I'd been staring at through the viewport feeds for the past hour. The edges were clean. Skin on one side of the knuckle line, something else on the other. No gradation or inflammation. Just a boundary between a man's hand and whatever had replaced the ends of his fingers. I crouched in front of him and looked at his face. His eyes tracked their invisible pattern without acknowledging me. His lips were moving. He was forming sounds below the threshold of hearing, a rapid, rhythmic repetition of something I couldn't make out. I leaned closer, close enough to feel the faint displacement of air from his mouth. The rhythm matched the drive resonance, the same frequency, the same interval, the same 4-second cycle I'd been watching on my console since we entered the cathedral. I pulled back and keyed my comm. Commander, Tob's fingertips have undergone some kind of material change. The affected tissue matches the visual properties of the structure outside the hull. Zero reflectance. Absolute dark. Clean transition line. No apparent injury. His eyes are responsive but tracking something we can't see. He's mouthing something at a rate that matches our drive resonance frequency. Silence from the bridge. Then, is it spreading? I looked at Tob's hands, studied the boundary between skin and dark at the knuckle line, watched it. The boundary held steady. The dark ended exactly at the knuckle line, unchanged from when Terrell had first described it. Stable as far as I can tell. Right now. Get back to the bridge. Terrell, stay on station. If anything changes, I want to know immediately. I stood. Tob's tracking gaze swept past me without catching, and for just a second, his lips paused in their rhythm and formed something I could almost read. Then they resumed. The same cadence, the same frequency, matched to the pulse of a drive that was running at minimum output, coupled to a structure that was running at something else entirely. I walked back to the bridge through the portside passageway, and every step of the way I could feel the hull beside me, the thin shell of alloy between the inside of the ship and the dark that had reached through a viewport and found Tob's hands and changed them into itself. When I reached my console, the resonance signal was still running. The structure was still answering our drive, even at minimum power. The waveform had not degraded. If anything, it had sharpened, a cleaner response, a tighter coupling, as though the cathedral had learned what it needed from our full power output and no longer required the volume to sustain the conversation. The wireframe on my display showed the corridor stretching ahead, branching, deepening. No exit in any direction, just more architecture. And at Station 6, Tobb's lips kept moving in the dark. I went back through every course plot I'd made since we crossed the boundary. Rext had the bridge locked into a holding routine. Drig on the helm maintaining our crawl through the center fork. Station 6 sealed after Tyrell reported Tobb was gone. The rest of the crew secured in their sections with hatches sealed. The ship ran on minimum power, and the resonance ran with it. That clean 4-second handshake between our drive and the walls. Nothing to do but wait and navigate and try to understand why the dark had eaten a man's fingertips. So I went back to the beginning. Every plot I'd made, every correction, every fork I'd chosen. I pulled the records and overlaid them on the current structural wireframe to see if the corridors we'd travelled were still the same shape. They were not. The passage behind us had changed. The wide corridor where we'd entered, 3 ships abreast, I'd mapped it carefully, had narrowed to barely our clearance width. And new corridors had appeared, branches that hadn't existed when we passed through, opening off the main passage at angles I recognized. I recognized them because I'd considered them. Every approach vector I'd evaluated and rejected during my plotting, every fork I'd looked at, calculated clearances for, and then decided against, had become a physical corridor in the structure. The branch I'd dismissed at the first junction because the gravitational gradient was too steep. It was there now, exactly the dimensions my instruments had projected. The tight channel I'd considered threading through before choosing the wider path. Real, solid, cut into the cathedral wall at exactly the angle I'd calculated. The cathedral was building my rejected thoughts into itself. I sat with that for a long time. The console's glow lit my hands, and I stared at the wireframe and traced the new corridors and matched them, one by one, to the navigation options I'd discarded. Every match was precise. The cathedral hadn't approximated my calculations. It had replicated them exactly, down to the clearance margins and the curvature profiles. As if it had been inside my plotting process, watching every option I'd weighed, and then constructing the ones I hadn't chosen, which meant it was reading intent. My intent. The spatial reasoning behind every course correction, including the paths that existed only as possibilities in my head before I dismissed them. I could not plan a route out of this place without simultaneously teaching it how to build more of itself. Before I could bring that to Rext, the damage control team came back. Rext had sent 4 men to inspect the outer hull in the section nearest Station 6. Standard procedure after an anomalous contact, checking for breach or material degradation. They'd gone out through the internal maintenance crawlway that ran between the inner and outer hull layers, carrying hand tools and portable scanners. They'd been gone 40 minutes. 3 came back through the crawlway hatch. 1 was walking. 2 were being carried. The walking man was a petty officer named Gust, and he came through the hatch with a look on his face that I'd seen once before, years ago, on a salvage rating who'd opened a compartment on a derelict and found the crew still at their stations, dead 6 months, preserved by vacuum, frozen in the middle of their last meal. The expression of someone who has seen something that broke a rule he didn't know existed. Gust was carrying the toolkits for all 4 men. The 2 being carried were conscious. Their arms were wrong. From the elbows down, both men's forearms had fused to the hull plating they'd been inspecting. The metal and their flesh shared the same surface, that zero reflectance black, seamless, as though someone had dipped their arms into the hull, and the boundary between skin and alloy had dissolved. One of them, a machinist's mate whose name I didn't know, still gripped his scanner in his right hand. The scanner was part of his hand now. The black had taken both. The men carrying them set them down in the port-side passageway and stepped back. The fused men sat against the bulkhead, calm. Their eyes had the same tracking pattern as Tobb's, smooth arcs following something invisible. Gust reported to Rext over the internal channel. We were inspecting the outer hull plating in Section 14, frame 60 through 80. The plating looked normal on approach. Couret touched it first. He meant the machinist's mate. He put his hand flat on the surface to check temperature, standard procedure. The metal went cold under his palm. Then dark. Then his hand went into it. Like pushing into deep water, no resistance, just the surface closing around him. He tried to pull back and there was nothing to pull back from. His hand and the hull were the same surface. Valden went to help, and it took him the same way. "Where's the fourth man?" "Paros. He touched a section aft of the others. Gust stopped, restarted. He went all the way in, Commander, up to his shoulders before I could reach him, and by the time I grabbed his belt, the hull had closed over his head. I pulled, couldn't move him, felt like pulling against a mountain. Then the belt came free in my hands and the surface was smooth where he'd been. Just hull, just dark." Rext's voice was very controlled. "Paros is inside the hull. Paros is the hull." I went to see the fused men, crouched in front of Couret, the machinist's mate, and studied the transition where his forearms became the zero reflectance material. The dark claimed everything below the elbow, including the scanner, the sleeve of his uniform, a section of the crawlway rail he'd apparently been bracing against. All one substance, all silent. Couret's lips moved in the same subsonic rhythm as Tobb's, and I could feel something. A vibration coming from both fused men at once. A frequency lower than the drive resonance, or maybe the same frequency, perceived differently through bone conduction at close range. I stood and walked to the nearest viewport. The passageway had one, a small reinforced window looking out into the cathedral. Through it, the massive columns slid past in the dark, and the vaulted space between them held that layered, viscous quality, darkness with depth, darkness you could fall into. The hull plating around the viewport's mounting frame had changed color, a faint darkening at the edges, where the frame met the bulkhead. Subtle. Easy to miss. The zero reflectance black creeping inward from the outer surface, converting the Carathal's alloy into cathedral material millimeter by millimeter. I watched it advance the width of a fingernail in the time it took me to draw 2 breaths. I went to the bridge and told Rext everything. The reshaping corridors, the matched navigation options, the intent reading. All of it. The bridge was quiet when I finished. Drigg had stopped pretending to monitor the helm. The sensor operators were listening. Rext stood at the command tier rail, gripping it with both hands, and I could see the calculations running behind his eyes. Tactical assessment, threat classification, options, costs, the same decision tree any competent commander builds when the situation turns. "You're telling me that every time you think about a route, even if you don't fly it, this thing builds a new corridor. That's what the data shows. And it's been doing this since we entered. Since at least my first course correction. Probably since the first scan. Then every route you've plotted has made it bigger, more complex, more of a maze." I didn't argue with that. It was accurate. "Shut it down." Rexted's voice carried the flat certainty of an order that's already been weighed. "Your console, your instruments, everything. Power down your station. No more plotting. No more scanning." "Commander, if I shut down, we're blind. You can't navigate without feeding it. You just told me that. So stop navigating. We drift. We conserve. We figure out another option." He looked at Drigg. "Helm, all stop. Kill the maneuvering drives. Bends. Main drive to 0 output. Sir, if we kill the drives entirely, we lose attitude control. Any gravitational... Do it!" The drives died. The resonance signal on my console flatlined for half a second, then returned, weaker, but present. The structure still vibrated at the 4-second interval, running on stored energy or its own momentum. It had learned the frequency. It no longer needed us to provide it. I powered down my station. The wireframe vanished. The navigation overlay went dark. I sat in front of a dead console on a drifting ship inside a structure that was growing itself out of my discarded thoughts. and I had nothing to do with my hands. Rext posted guards. It was a military response and a sound one. Seal the sections, post armed men at the main junction points, maintain a perimeter even if the threat wasn't something you could shoot. He pulled 4 men from the security detail and stationed them at the corridor intersections between the bridge, the engineering section, the lower hold where the wounded lay sedated, and the portside passageway where the fused crewmen sat against the bulkhead. The guards took their positions. They watched the corridors. They made decisions about sight lines and cover and fields of fire. 18 minutes later, 2 of them stopped moving. The pair at the junction between the bridge corridor and the main lateral passage, a corporal named Hulk and a private whose name I never learned, went still at the same moment. Weapons up, eyes forward, stance textbook, frozen mid-watch. Their fingers had already begun the transition where they gripped their rifles, the zero reflectance black flowing from the weapon stocks into their hands, up through their gloves, past the wrists. I reached the junction 20 seconds after the bridge watch reported them unresponsive. Hulk's eyes tracked invisible shapes. His lips moved in the rhythm. His rifle was part of his body now, fused from stock to shoulder, the weapon and the man one continuous piece of cathedral material. Rext arrived behind me and saw it and stood very still. The guards had been thinking tactically, evaluating corridors, assessing approach routes, choosing where to aim, how to cover, which direction held the greatest threat. Crude spatial reasoning compared to void navigation, but spatial reasoning all the same. The cathedral had pivoted. When I stopped feeding it refined navigational data, it found a coarser substitute. It's taking anyone who thinks about space, I told Rext. Anyone who makes decisions about where things are and how to move through them. My plotting was the richest source, but tactical assessment works too. Anything that involves choosing a path. Rext looked at Hulk, at the dark spreading up the man's arms, at the rifle melting into his shoulder. Then he looked at me. The wounded in the hold. Prael has them sedated. And they're untouched. That's the pattern. Active spatial reasoning gets harvested. Unconscious minds are invisible to it. Then we sedate everyone. Everyone who's left. And who navigates us out while the entire crew sleeps? There it was, the core of it, the thing the cathedral had constructed around us. A trap that couldn't be escaped by thinking because thinking was the fuel, and a trap that couldn't be escaped without thinking because someone had to find the way out. Rext ordered the remaining crew to the lower hold. Everyone except himself, myself, Prael the medical officer, and Drig on the helm. Prael was to sedate everyone he could safely sedate, including the walking wounded, the remaining security detail, and the support staff. 14 crew, all told, not counting the 60 sedated wounded. The fused crewmen were left where they sat. Moving them would require cutting through hull plating that was now cathedral material, and no one wanted to find out what happened when you cut into it. The ship emptied around us. Hatches opening and closing, boots on the deck plates, the muffled sound of Prael's voice giving instructions in the hold. Then quiet. The Carathel drifted, engines dead, most of her crew unconscious, a skeleton of 4 men awake on a ship that was being digested. Rext, Drig and Prael stayed on the bridge. I stayed at my dead console. We spoke in short practical exchanges, water, watch rotation, monitoring the hull conversions spread. Nobody discussed what had happened to Tob, or Hulk, or Paros. The facts were sufficient. Interpretation was a luxury we couldn't afford. I sat at my console and tried to think about nothing. It is surprisingly hard to empty your mind when you've spent 22 years training it to read space. Every surface my eyes touched became a distance calculation. Every corridor visible through the bridge viewports became a routing problem. I caught myself estimating clearances, projecting curves, evaluating the structural columns visible through the forward viewport in terms of their navigational properties. Which gaps were flyable? Which formations could shelter a ship? Every one of those involuntary assessments was food. I closed my eyes. The calculations kept running. My mind modelled the cathedral from memory. The wireframe I'd built over the past hours, the corridors, the branches, the columns, the vaulted spaces. It was all still in my head, and my head kept working on it the way a tongue works at a broken tooth. Automatic, compulsive, professional instinct with nowhere to go. I opened my eyes and looked at the forward viewport instead. Just looked. Passive, receptive. The dark and the columns and the slow drift of the ship through a space that shouldn't exist. And something moved. Deep in the cathedral, beyond the nearest columns, in the layered darkness between the vaulted walls. A shape. Tall. 30 meters, maybe 40. Scaled to the architecture the way a person is scaled to a doorway. It moved with a slow, processional gait, one long stride every few seconds, and its outline was humanoid in the loosest possible sense. A torso, limbs, a head, all composed of the same zero-reflectant substance as the walls, the columns, the fused sections of the carathal's hull. It didn't reflect the ship's running lights. It registered as a moving absence, a hole in the shape of a walking figure, displacing the layered dark as it passed between the columns. A priest. The word came to me unbidden, from the shape's movement, from the architecture, from the proportional logic of a figure scaled to serve a structure. Priest. I'd never read the term in any survey or briefing, but the shape moved with such measured purpose that the word fit like a key into a lock. A being that served a function in the structure the way a cleric serves a function in a church. Behind the priest, smaller shapes walked in the same cadence. 5 of them, single file, spaced at even intervals. Human-sized, human-shaped. Tob, Curette, Valden, Hulk, the unnamed private. Still wearing the outlines of their uniforms. Still shaped like the men they'd been. All dark. All zero reflectance, all walking in lockstep with the priest's processional rhythm. They moved with a fluidity their living bodies hadn't possessed. Curette's gait free of the knee injury he'd been favouring, Hulk's left shoulder loose and easy. The cathedral had remade them without their damage, and one more shape at the rear of the procession. Broader, shorter. Arms held slightly away from his body, in a posture I recognized as the instinctive brace of a man who'd been carrying heavy tools. Paros, the one who'd gone all the way into the hull. 6 crew, walking in the dark, part of the architecture. They passed between 2 columns, and the layered darkness swallowed them. The priest's tall shape lingered a moment longer, still moving, and then it was gone too, absorbed into a vaulted space deeper in the structure that I couldn't resolve from this distance. Rex was beside me. He'd seen it too. We stood at the viewport, 2 men on a dead bridge, and watched the empty dark where our people had been. Then my console lit up. I turned. The station was powered down. I'd killed it myself, physically disconnected the primary feed. The screen should have been black glass. Instead, a navigation line drew itself across the display in a projection medium the console had no capability to produce. A bright, clean line on a dark field, tracing a route through the cathedral's geometry. It plotted itself in real time, corridor by corridor, turn by turn. The route led from our current position to a point deep in the structure. The terminus brightened once, a symbol I'd never encountered in any navigational database. A glyph that looked like a doorway folded into itself, recursive, open. I knew what it meant the way you know what a hand extended toward you means. Come in. Sit down. We've been expecting you. The cathedral had drawn me a route to its centre, and it was the most beautiful piece of navigation I had ever seen. I studied the route for too long. Rex had gone back to the command tier to raise Prail on the internal channel, and Drigg was asleep in the helm chair. True sleep, not sedation, his body simply giving out after hours of sustained fear. I was alone with the line on my dead console, and I traced it the way a student traces the brushwork of a master, following each segment through the cathedral's geometry with the part of my brain that had spent 22 years learning how space fits together. The route was extraordinary. Every turn exploited a gravitational gradient I'd missed in my own mapping. Every corridor transition used the cathedral's internal density variations to create acceleration without thrust. Passive navigation, riding the structure's own mass distribution like a current. I'd never seen anything like it. The elegance wasn't human. It operated on principles I could recognize but hadn't invented. Spatial logic that started where my training ended and kept going. I wanted to follow it the way a thirsty man wants water. The professional hunger was physical, a pull in my chest, a leaning forward at the cellular level. Here was navigation beyond anything my species had achieved, and it was being offered to me. Personally, by name almost, the route was calibrated to my ship's dimensions, my console's display parameters, my plotting conventions. The cathedral knew how I worked and had composed this specifically for me. Rex's voice broke through. "Moran, step away from that console." I looked up. He was at the command tier rail, watching me with the particular attention of a man assessing whether someone under his authority has been compromised. His sidearm was unholstered. He hadn't pointed it at anything. He'd just freed it from the retention clip and let his hand rest on the grip. A quiet statement of preparation. "I'm not following the route." "You're reading it. You told me an hour ago that reading is enough." He came down from the tier, slow, keeping distance. "Every second you spend analyzing that line, you're feeding it your spatial reasoning. The best spatial reasoning it's found on this ship. Step away." He was right. I knew he was right. Every elegant segment I traced, every gradient I admired, my mind was modeling the cathedral's architecture in finer detail than my instruments ever had, and the cathedral was harvesting every model. My admiration was dinner. I pushed back from the console. The route stayed on the screen, bright against the dark glass. "We need to talk about the drive core." I looked at him. "Overload." He let the word sit. "If we can push the core past its containment threshold, the detonation should crack the local structure. Maybe enough to scatter rubble into open space. The navigational beacon in the wreckage might reach a relay if we're close enough to the opacity's edge. That kills everyone aboard." "Everyone aboard is either converted, sedated, or sitting in a dead ship inside a thing that eats thoughts. What's your alternative?" I didn't have one. That was the problem. Every alternative required navigation, and navigation was the weapon the cathedral used against us. The only move that denied it completely was destruction. The drive core reduced to expanding plasma, the carathal reduced to fragments, every living and converted mind aboard reduced to raw matter too scattered to hold a pattern. The converted crew are walking in a procession inside a dark matter temple, Moran. Their cathedral property. We saw it. He was right about that too. Tob, Corette, Valden, Hulk, the Private, Paros, gone, reshaped. Walking in cadence with a priest that was older than human spaceflight and as tall as the Carathal's beam. Bringing them back was a fantasy, and Rex had the professional clarity to say so. "Give me 10 minutes." "For what?" "To check something. Then I'll help you set the overload." He weighed me for a long 5 seconds. Then he holstered the sidearm and went to wake Drigg, because the overload procedure needed 3 men. One at the core, one at the fuel isolation, one on the bridge to monitor containment. I went back to my console. The route glowed. This time I kept my eyes on the terminus only, the glyph, the folded doorway, and thought about what was on the other end. The viewport projection during the procession had shown me a vaulted space deeper in. A nave, I assumed, with concentric rings of pillar shapes. The cathedral's collection. Navigators from other species, other eras, preserved as architectural nodes. Each one a mind that had been lured, converted, and incorporated into the structure to make it more complex, more capable, more efficient at catching the next ship. I was being recruited. The cathedral wanted my spatial cognition the way a temple wants a new icon, something to place in the nave, something to venerate, something to use. My patterns of thought would become corridors. My instincts would become walls. My 22 years of reading dangerous space would be frozen into architecture that would attract and trap ships for millennia after Morandras stopped being a person and became a structural element. I stood up from the console and walked to the engineering section. The route from the bridge to engineering ran through the main lateral passageway, past the junction where Hulk and the private had been standing when the cathedral took them. Their bodies were gone, converted, and walked away with the procession, leaving only the dark imprints where their boots had fused to the deck plating. 2 shadow stains in the shape of military footwear, perfectly preserved. The passageway walls had advanced. The hull conversion I'd measured earlier, the zero reflectance black creeping inward from the outer hull, had reached the inner surface in several sections. I walked through stretches where the Carathal's original alloy gave way to cathedral material, and the transition was visible as a tide line on the bulkheads. Grey service metal on one side, absolute dark on the other, the boundary advancing centimetre by centimetre while I walked. In one section, the dark surface held shapes, faces, hands, fragments of uniforms and equipment from species I had no reference for, pressed into the wall like fossils in sedimentary rock, preserved with exacting fidelity. Every wrinkle, every insignia, every finger joint captured in the zero reflectant substance as though the wall had closed around them like amber. Some of the faces were old, eroded, features softened by time until the original species was unguessable, just the vague suggestion of eyes and a mouth worn smooth over millennia of slow degradation. And among them, very new, very sharp, the imprint of Tob's face. Eyes open, mouth still shaping the subsonic rhythm, locked into the wall of a ship that had stopped being a ship and become an extension of the temple. I put my hand up, close to the surface, close enough to feel something radiating from it, a pure absence, as though the dark pulled heat and light and presence out of the air in front of it and offered nothing in return. My fingers tingled. I pulled back. Engineering was 2 hatches farther aft. I passed through them, dogged them behind me, and stood in front of the drive core housing. The core sat behind blast shielding in a containment cradle at the center of the compartment, a sphere of dense layered alloy surrounding the reaction mass that powered the Carathal's main drive. The overload procedure was straightforward in concept. Disable the containment safeties, increase fuel flow past the rated maximum, and let the reaction go critical. The resulting detonation would vaporize everything within a radius that depended on the core's fuel load, which in our case was enough to crack a respectable hole in almost any structure. I opened the access panel on the primary containment monitor and began the first stage. Disconnecting the safety interlocks was mechanical work, physical switches, manual bypasses, tasks that required hands and a sequence of memorized steps. The kind of work that didn't involve spatial reasoning. My hands moved through the procedure and my mind stayed blank, focused on the tactile sensation of each switch, the resistance of each bypass lever, the click of each interlock disengaging. Rext's voice came over the intercom from the bridge. He'd woken Drig and stationed him at the fuel isolation panel in the secondary engineering bay, 1 deck above. Moran, status. First stage complete. Interlocks are off. Ready for fuel isolation override on your mark. Drig, confirm position. Drig's voice, groggy but functional. Fuel isolation panel, standing by. On my mark, Drig opens the override. Moran, you'll have about 90 seconds to set the flow rate before containment pressure exceeds the housing tolerances. Once it passes that threshold, it's irreversible. We'll have maybe 4 minutes. Understood. Moran. A pause. This is the right call. I put my hand on the fuel flow control and waited for his mark. The cathedral opened a corridor. Every sensor on the carousel registered it at once. The collision alarms, the hull proximity monitors, the dead navigation console on the bridge that shouldn't have been capable of registering anything. Rext's voice cut off mid-breath as the data hit his displays, but I caught his mark. Driggs swore as he opened the override. The deck plating shuddered under my boots. A vibration different from the 4-second resonance, something larger, structural, as though the walls of the cathedral were shifting position around the ship. I ran to the nearest viewport. Stars. Outside the carousel, the layered dark had split. A gap in the cathedral's architecture, a corridor leading outward through the structure, and at its far end, distant but unmistakable, open space. Real stars. The faint blue wash of a stellar nursery. The deep black of vacuum that was just vacuum, empty and clean and free. An exit. Rext's voice came back on the intercom, raw with something I hadn't heard from him before. "Moran, are you seeing this?" "I see it. It's a clear corridor, wide enough for us with margin. Structural density thins as it goes. It opens into real space." He was reading from the sensors that had woken themselves on the bridge, the cathedral projecting the data directly into the Carathal's systems. "This is a way out. This is an offer." Silence. "Commander, the cathedral reads intent. It knows what we're doing to the drive core. This corridor appeared the moment I finished the first stage of the overload sequence. It's a transaction. We stop the detonation, we take the exit, and the crew, already converted, stays here. Permanently. The cathedral keeps what it has: Tob, Curate, Valden, Hulk, the Private, Paros, and it lets the rest of us go." Rext processed that for maybe 3 seconds. "Abort the overload. We're taking the exit. Commander, 14 sedated crew in the lower hold. Moran, Prail, Drigg, you, me. The 6 it's taken are gone. You said that yourself. You saw them walking. We cannot save them by dying next to them. Abort the overload and get to the bridge." I stood in engineering with my hand on the fuel flow control and looked at the viewport. The exit corridor stretched outward through the dark, wide and clear. Stars glinting at the far end like a promise written in light. The cathedral was offering me exactly what I'd told Rext I couldn't find. A way out. A navigable path through the structure to open space. The only cost was the crew already embedded in its walls, already walking in its processions, already converted into architectural nodes that would serve the temple until time eroded them to featureless columns. Paros, who'd gone through the hull up to his shoulders before it closed over his head, who was walking in the dark right now in the shape of a man who carried heavy tools. I keyed the second stage. The fuel flow control engaged. The containment monitor began its climb toward critical pressure. Rext heard the alarm on his bridge display, and his voice came through the intercom stripped of all professional composure. "Moran, abort. That is a direct order. Abort the sequence." The containment pressure climbed. The Carathal vibrated with the core's increasing output, a deep structural tremor that ran through every deck plate and bulkhead. The exit corridor was still there outside the viewport, still open, still showing stars. The cathedral hadn't withdrawn the offer. It was waiting. The pressure gauge read 60% of housing tolerance. 70. The 4-minute clock would start at 100. I watched the exit. I watched the gauge. The exit began to close. Slowly. The walls of the corridor drew together, the cathedral's architecture contracting around the gap like a wound healing. The stars at the far end dimmed as the passage narrowed. The offer had a shelf life, and I was burning through it. 80%. Rext had stopped talking. Drigg was shouting something from the fuel isolation panel, his words lost in the vibration. The core housing groaned, a deep, metallic complaint from metal under pressures it was never designed to sustain. 85. I looked at the corridor. Still passable. Closing, but passable. If I aborted now and ran for the bridge, If Rex got the drives restarted, if Drig kept the fuel isolation nominal, we could make it. Tight, with hulls scraping against cathedral walls, but flyable. I could see the clearances in my head, the approach angles, the acceleration curve needed to clear the narrowing gap before it sealed. The navigation calculated itself. Involuntary. Automatic. My mind modeled the run the way a tongue works at a broken tooth. I aborted the overload. The fuel flow control disengaged. The containment pressure began its bleed-off, the core settling back from the edge. I sealed the engineering bay behind me and ran. The passageway to the bridge was a gauntlet of converted hull, dark walls closing in, the imprint of Tob's face frozen in the surface as I passed, other faces from other species watching with eroded eyes. I ran through it, and the cathedral drank in my route finding with every stride, every turn, every split-second assessment of which hatch to take and which corridor was faster. I could feel it taking, the way you can feel someone reading over your shoulder. Every spatial decision I made in those seconds was a gift to the structure, a fresh template it would use to build new corridors and catch new ships. I reached the bridge. Rex was already at the helm. He'd moved Drig's unconscious form aside. The fuel isolation reversal must have been the last thing Drig managed before the stress took him. Rex had the maneuvering drives online, coaxing power from a core that was still cooling down from nearly going critical. Heading. I dropped into my console. The dead station blazed to life under my hands, the cathedral feeding it power, giving me instruments. The exit corridor filled the display, narrow and narrowing. 32 degrees port, 7 degrees down angle, full available thrust. The carathel lurched forward. The maneuvering drives fired ragged and uneven, the core damaged from the aborted overload, and the ship slewed into the corridor with all the grace of a brick thrown through a window. Cathedral walls rushed past the viewports, the hull screamed, metal grinding against dark matter, the carathel's original alloy, and the converted sections dragging across cathedral substance with a sound like tearing cloth, amplified through the bones of the ship. I called corrections, continuous, instinctive. The corridor narrowed, and I threaded the ship through it by feel, by training, by the deep spatial intuition that had defined my career. Every correction was a meal for the cathedral. Every adjustment gave it new data about how a human navigator reads a closing gap, compensates for damaged thrust, prioritizes clearance over speed. I was feeding it the richest, most complex navigation of my life, a masterclass in human spatial reasoning performed under maximum stress. And it was the only way out. The gap narrowed to meters. The hull scraped both walls. A structural member tore free somewhere aft and the ship yawed and I corrected, and the correction was beautiful. The exact right input at the exact right moment, saving the ship by a margin so thin it existed only in the mathematics. Then we were through. Open space, real vacuum, stars in every direction, hard and clean and indifferent. The stellar nursery's blue wash painted the port side of the hull. Behind us, the opacity hung in the dark, a mass of solid shadow, a cloud-shaped cathedral, its exit corridor already sealed, its surface smooth and featureless. The Valdari cruisers were gone. Hours passed, probably. Moved on to other targets, other pursuits. The border war continued without us. The carathel drifted in open space with half its crew missing, its hull scarred with converted sections that would never be alloy again, its core damaged, its drive producing barely enough thrust to maintain attitude. Rex slumped over the helm, still breathing, just spent. I sat at my console in the sudden enormous silence and looked at the navigation display. The route I'd plotted through the closing corridor was still on the screen. Every correction, every adjustment, every instinctive compensation, drawn in clean, bright lines on a dark field, recorded in a projection medium my console had never possessed before today. The lines were intricate, layered. They showed a level of precision and spatial awareness that exceeded anything in my professional history. each segment resolving a navigational problem I hadn't consciously identified until my hands were already solving it. They were the best work I'd ever done, and they were drawn in the cathedral's hand as much as mine. I stared at the lines and recognized techniques in them that I hadn't used, approaches to gravitational compensation that came from the route the cathedral had shown me on the dead console, principles of passive acceleration that I'd absorbed in those minutes of studying its invitation. The cathedral had taught me things during our exchange, slipped them into my spatial reasoning like seeds into soil. And in the final, desperate navigation through the closing gap, those seeds had flowered. I would carry them now. Every route I plotted through dangerous space for the rest of my career would contain echoes of what the cathedral had given me. Techniques and instincts that were partly alien, partly architectural, shaped by a structure that had been collecting navigational minds for longer than humanity had been looking at the stars. My navigation would be better, sharper, more elegant, and I would never be certain, on any given correction, whether the insight was mine or an extension of a temple that had learned how humans move through the dark and sent one of them home as a carrier. The opacity hung behind us, vast and still. Inside it, the imprint of Tob's face watched from a wall. Paris walked in a procession. 6 men served as nodes in an architecture that would use their patterns until time wore them smooth, and then it would wait for the next ship to wander in. I powered down the console. The lines vanished, but I could still see them when I closed my eyes. Every turn and segment committed to a memory that was no longer entirely my own. The carousel drifted toward the nearest relay beacon, and I sat in the dark with my hands in my lap and let the ship carry me wherever it was already going.